Come on, bro, let them put it on there.
Hello, everybody. Good morning. My name is Tuesday Raytano. I'm the Deputy Director of the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. We are thrilled to see so many of you online for the launch of one of our latest reports, which is called The Intersection of Irregular Migration and Trafficking in West Africa and the Sahel. The report author, Arezzo Malakuti, is with us to present the findings of the report, talk you through some of the most interesting trends, and to explain the very innovative methodology she did to capture this criminal phenomena. We are really excited to be putting this report out into the public domain and to have an opportunity to exchange with so many people who I know have an interested knowledge in the region and on this topic in particular. Arezzo, it was particularly nice for us actually to have Arezzo back this morning. She was a full-time staff member at the GI when she wrote this report, has since enjoyed the liberties that the pandemic has offered, which let's all say off.
I'm mute.
Sorry, I got muted by the host, which I'm not quite sure what they're trying to imply. But nonetheless, I think I was in the middle of an enthusiastic introduction of Arezzo, who was a former full-time team member with the GI and is now working more independently as an expert in irregular migration and migration dynamics, as well as protection security risks to those moving irregularly in North Africa and West Africa. Before we kick off the discussion, which is open and you're very welcome to share, we have some introductory and welcome remarks from the funder of our joint project, the European Union. This project and all of the research that we did under it was funded by the EU Emergency Trust Fund for Africa, and we're very pleased to have the program manager of our window of that trust fund, Aylin Gull, with us. Aylin, do you want to unmute and take from me?
Yes, hello Tuesday. I don't know if you can hear me.
We can hear you and see you, so go right ahead.
Great. Good morning to everybody. Good morning, Tuesday. Thank you very much for this introduction and for the organization of this launch event about a study which we were also looking very much forward. As you were saying, we have funded this study under the North of Africa window of the EU Emergency Trust Fund for Africa. The content of this study, of course, is the opinion of the author Arezzo, with whom we have cooperated closely, and we thank her very much for our efforts. I think this study is very much needed and essential for the work of a trust fund, especially because we are operating and working on actions related to the topic of the study, and our cooperation with you in order to get more knowledge and various information on the dynamics in the region is very valuable. So I wanted to pass this message of gratitude on behalf of my team to all of you. Thank you very much, and looking forward for the presentation.
Thank you so much, Hélène. It's great to have the partnership, and we appreciate the support. So we're going to have about 30 minutes worth of presentation from Arezzo, which will then leave us 20 minutes at the end to have a discussion and to take questions and answers from the floor. Arezzo, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tuesday. Great to be here, and thank you also, Eileen, for joining us today and for offering those remarks. Great to see you again. I'm going to, as Tuesday said, I will present some of the key findings from the research, and I have a little bit of a presentation that will go along with it. I hope you can see it okay. So I will get started without further ado. The name of the study, as you are probably aware, is the intersection of irregular migration and trafficking in West Africa and the Sahel, understanding the patterns of vulnerability. So before I get started, just quickly a brief agenda of what we will go through today over the next 30 minutes. I'm going to start off with a bit of a background, so explaining a little bit why we decided to do this study and what is the context within which we're looking at these dynamics. Then I will look at the sample, so looking a little bit at the technicalities of the research, how we structured it. Then I will look at experience with trafficking along the routes and the factors influencing the vulnerability.
I got into the Zoom meeting, but I tell you, it was a drama. I restarted the computer twice.
I might just request that put yourself on mute if you are today a participant listening to the presentation, because we can hear each other if we're not on mute. Thank you so much, everyone. I always mess that up myself as well. I always forget to put myself on mute. And finally, I will look at some recommendations. If we have some time, we'll look at trafficking in source countries, but today we're going to really be looking mainly at trafficking along the routes. So to look at the background, firstly, an introduction. So the reason, let's say, the context within which we decided to do this study was that there have been a number of policy and security changes in the Mediterranean, North Africa, and the Sahel over the last 5 years that have led to a shift in mobility options towards Europe. More specifically, it's become more difficult for irregular migrants to be smuggled to Europe from North Africa and the Sahel. Some of these changes include more detention centers in Libya that have been opened by militia groups. There was also a memorandum of understanding between Libya and Italy, which led to smuggling work in the region, and also the capacity of the Libyan Coast Guard was reinforced, which meant it was more difficult for migrants to cross the Mediterranean. There was the anti-smuggling law in Niger in 2015, which shifted the routes towards Libya, i.e. it became more difficult for migrants to be able to move from Niger to Libya. And so new routes started to open up, or let's say they're not new, but became prominent again via Algeria, and then there were deportations from Algeria back to Mali and Niger, so also getting blocked on those Algerian routes. And then there was also a smaller movement that developed to Libya via Chad, where West African migrants would join East African migrants who had rerouted from Darfur to Chad because of the greater security along the Sudanese-Libyan border. So all of this is basically resulted in a very big decrease in arrivals through the Mediterranean. And the map on this slide demonstrates how in 2019, the movements through the central Mediterranean decreased very drastically, but so did the overall numbers across the three routes. We had close to 120,000 migrants arrive across the three routes in 2019, which is one of the lowest, let's say, numbers we've ever seen. But the unintended consequences of some of these decisions and consequent decrease in arrivals in Europe were that the journeys became more clandestine and more dangerous as migrants faced greater levels of risk, and smuggling and trafficking networks also regrouped and repositioned themselves. And so in this context, we wanted to look at whether the trafficking of migrants along these routes had shifted or changed as a result of the greater difficulty and the greater risk along these routes. And of course, as we all know, trafficking is a very difficult phenomenon to research and to track because victims, it's so clandestine, and because victims are unlikely to want to speak about their experiences because of the trauma involved. And for that reason, we wanted to look at the pattern of vulnerability towards trafficking rather than just tracking the numbers of trafficked victims, or let's say quantifying the trafficking phenomenon. We wanted to understand, has the people that are vulnerable to human trafficking along these routes, has their profile shifted? Has it changed as a result of the context? So in terms of methodology for this research, we had 4 research modules. The first one was a literature and secondary data review to look at what had been done on the topic and to see where we could actually build upon gaps in the literature and in the research. Then we did a very big survey. But before the survey, we had a pre-survey scoping phase where we went to the 2 survey sites, which were, or the 2 survey countries, which were Mali and Niger, and identified our survey sites. And we had 6 survey sites in total, which I will go through in a second. Then we conducted a survey with 1,689 migrants across Mali and Niger, a quantitative survey. And we also conducted 39 key informant interviews across the same 2 countries and Nigeria and Senegal. The analysis also builds upon 149 qualitative interviews with migrants that we conducted between December 2018 and September 2019 in the region. Basically, the purpose of the survey was to explore 3 specific things. One was the circulation of information along the routes. So how much do migrants know about the increased risk and the changes in the routes? How do they try and address their vulnerability as a result of these changes? We also want to look at the financing and work options and strategies of migrants along the routes. These 4 things were proxies. We used them as proxies to help us assess the pattern of vulnerability to trafficking. If you'd like more information on how we did that, it's explained quite thoroughly in the report. And in terms of sampling, so the overall sample, as I said, was 1,689 migrants. The survey was conducted in Mali and Niger, and the table on the right-hand side identifies the 6 survey sites within which we conducted the survey and shows how many interviews were conducted in each site. Now, since the proportion of the overall migrant population that is represented by each nationality is not known, we decided to select migrant respondents at random across these predetermined survey sites and according to predetermined quotas in terms of the numbers of migrants we would speak to in each site. And by creating that randomized sample, we hope to get a sense of the proportion of each nationality that is represented in each of these countries and on these routes. The pie graph on the right-hand side then shows what proportion of the overall sample was represented by each survey site, the survey sites being Bamako and Timbuktu in Mali and Niamey, Agadez, Zinder and Tawa in Niger. So looking a little bit at the sample statistics now, I'm going to go through a little bit of a description of what our sample looked like, because this then, of course, helps us to interpret the information and the key findings that I will present in the next section. So just quickly, in terms of socio-demographics, the sample covered 31 nationalities and 12% of our respondents were women. The graph on the left-hand side shows you how the sample was distributed amongst nationalities across the two different countries. And in terms of age distribution, our sample was mainly distributed between the ages of 21 and 35, with a particular concentration at 26 to 30. We had very few respondents below 20 and very few respondents above 40, as can be seen by that graph. Looking at other socio-demographic markers, the first graph here shows us the sample according to marital status and gender, and we see that there's not much variation here, although men were more likely to be single than women, and the majority of our sample was actually single. And when we look at the sample according to religion and gender, across the entire sample, 30% were Christian and 65% were Muslim. When it comes to female migrants, we have a greater representation of Christians. So the majority were Christian at 54%, and only 38% of women were Muslim. And when it comes to men, 27% were Christian and 69% were Muslim. So men are more likely to be Muslim and women are more likely to be Christian. It should be noted that the majority of the women in our sample came from two countries, Nigeria and Ghana, and both of these countries are majority Christian. So this may help describe or explain why we have an overrepresentation of Christian women. And the last graph looks at the sample according to education and gender. What we can see here is that our sample is predominantly lowly educated. So if we look at the entire sample, the graph shows that 46% were only educated up to primary school, and 22% received no formal education. And this doesn't change very much according to men or women. Then when we look at migrant profiles, so our sample was split up in terms of 4 migrant profiles. We selected these profiles before developing the survey, and then included filter questions at the beginning of the survey to make sure that every person we interviewed would fit into one of these 4 categories. So the first category was migrating, what we call migrating respondents. And this is basically migrants that are on their way to a new country that is not their origin country. Then we have recently returned migrants, so respondents who originate from one of the survey countries, that is Niger or Mali, but have returned home within the last 3 months and are not intending to migrate right now. Then we have recently settled migrants who are respondents who are not from the survey country, so they're not Nigerians or Malians, and they do not intend to migrate to another country in the next month. And then we have returning home, who are respondents that are not native to the survey country. So they are migrants, they're not Malians or Nigerians, and they are also on their way back to their home country. The reason why we created these 4 categories was to make sure that we have a good cross-section of the migrant profiles along the routes. The 2 categories, recently returned and returning home, allow us also to have an insight into trafficking dynamics further north beyond the Sahel, because we're talking to migrants who have come back from Europe or North Africa. So in terms of these overall profiles, all of the profiles pretty much followed the socio-demographic markers of the entire sample. The only group that showed different socio-demographic markers was the recently returned group. For example, women dropped to 3% compared to 12% on the overall sample. We had 97% Muslim instead of 65% on the overall sample, and they were far less educated than the rest of the sample, and they were overrepresented in the agricultural sector when we talked to them about their occupations. It's important to note here that the recently returned category are only Nigerians and Malians, and this is why this could account for some of these differences. But the idea is that the migrant profiles pretty much cover the cover the same sociodemographic markers. The graph on the pie chart on the bottom shows the proportion of the sample that was represented by each group, and the migrating group are by far the largest, representing 79% of the sample. So quickly looking at the routes, because this does factor into our analysis, this first map is a broad look at the routes through Mali and Niger, and it places them in a regional context. So here we are looking at all of the routes towards Europe. If it's a little bit confusing, don't worry. The idea is to show that there are a lot of routes moving towards North Africa and across the Mediterranean, and that the routes through Niger and Mali actually fit into broader migration patterns. But here we'll zoom in on the routes through Niger and Mali specifically. So here in Niger, the most important thing to note here is that since the passing of the anti-smuggling law, the traditional hub, which was Agadez, is less prominent now, and we have new routes moving from Zinder and Tawa. Some of them go through Agadez, but some of them move along the borders towards the north. The other big difference here is that there are no clear entry or exit points between Libya and Niger anymore, as migrants and smugglers try and find ways to cross that border. And there are also routes from Agadez into Algeria, from where migrants try to access Libya from that western border between Algeria and Libya. When we look at the routes through Mali, so here what we have is that quite a bit of instability in the middle of the country, which causes some migrants to actually move from Bamako to Niamey, and then some of them move from Niamey into Gao and then go immediately north as a way to avoid the center of the country. Moving on to experience with trafficking along the routes. Sorry, one last thing I should say about the routes that came out of the analysis is that we found that migrants who are on their way to Europe are more likely to move via Mali than Niger. Now, in terms of experience with trafficking along the routes, the first thing that we looked at was the forms of trafficking. The survey was structured around 5 forms of trafficking or 6 forms of abuse. So the 5 forms of trafficking were kidnapping, forced labor, slavery, sexual abuse, and organ trafficking, as shown in the graph here. And we also included detention, although it's not technically a form of trafficking, because detention in North Africa is so intimately linked with trafficking dynamics. So what's important here is that a whopping 60% of our samples said that they had experienced some form of trafficking. 54% reported that they had been detained along the routes. 40% said that it had been by non-officials, and 14% said that they had been detained by officials. When it comes to organ trafficking, only 3% of our sample reported being victims of organ trafficking, but in addition to that 3%, a further 4% said that they had been approached with offers of money for their blood and organs, so potentially a growing phenomenon. In terms of forced labor, 11% of our sample said that they had been victims of forced labor, and over 20% of migrants who worked along the route were not paid for their work, even when it was not in a context of forced labor. And close to 40% of migrants who were pushed into forced labor were still paid for their work. So this shows that the dynamics are quite nuanced in the region. When we look at the prevalence of trafficking or the scope of trafficking, we were able to create a spectrum amongst our sample. So 40% of our sample had not been trafficked at all, and so we give them a score of 0. 26% of our sample reported that they had only been detained and not experienced any other form of trafficking, so we give them a score of 1. And migrants who had been detained and kidnapped or extorted represent 22% of the sample, and we give them a score of 2. And migrants who had been detained and kidnapped or extorted and were the victim of at least one other form of trafficking represent 12% of the sample, and we give them a score of 3. So as to create a spectrum in order to understand the severity or the prevalence of trafficking along the routes. So when we look at the scoring across the 6 forms of abuse, that's what's presented in the graph on the bottom, because we also, in addition to asking migrants to report on their own experience of trafficking, we also ask them to comment on what they had witnessed amongst other migrants. And the reason why we put these questions into the survey is because we know that victims of trafficking are not always comfortable talking about what they have experienced. So depersonalizing the question often helps us to gain information in another way. So instead of asking them about their own experiences in a series of questions in the survey, we also ask them to comment on what they had witnessed. So for example, when we look at organ trafficking and male sexual abuse, so that's the black in the graph and the brown or gray in the graph, we find that it starts to dissipate at 30% and is almost non-existent past 50%. So that means that the sample believes that less than 30% of people on the move are experiencing this type of abuse. Forced labor is increasing until 70%. So our sample believed that close to 70% of people along the routes are being trafficked into forced labor, but then it starts to decrease after 70%. It's also important to note that close to 20% of respondents believe that 91 to 100% of migrants along the routes are victims of forced labor. Illegal detention is also high across the entire sample, with close to 30% of respondents believing that almost all migrants are victims of this form of abuse. And slavery and the sexual abuse of women remain fairly constant across the scale. Locations where trafficking occurs, the diagram represents each form of trafficking or abuse that we looked at, the percentage where migrants believe it's happening in each of those 6 countries: Libya, Algeria, Niger, Nigeria, Mali, and Morocco. The data shows that forced labor is most commonly reported in Libya, but it's also highly reported in Algeria and Niger. Detention is more commonly reported in Algeria than Libya. Slavery is most commonly reported in Libya, followed by Algeria. Kidnapping is most commonly reported in Algeria, then Libya and Mali, followed by Niger. Sexual exploitation is most commonly reported in Libya, then Mali, then Algeria, and organ trafficking most commonly in Libya and then Algeria. And it's the most commonly reported form of trafficking in Nigeria. So now the crux of the research, the factors influencing vulnerability to trafficking. The first thing we looked at was gender. And it's important here to note that 74% of female respondents reported falling victim to trafficking, compared to only 58% of men. And they were also more severely trafficked. So if we look at the graph, it shows the trafficking score across the entire sample, and then according to the male section of the sample and the female section of the sample. When we look at a trafficking score of 3 or more, so being victim of at least 3 forms of trafficking, 24% of women said that they had a score of 3 or more, compared to 11% of men and 12% of the entire sample. Women who said they had not experienced any form of trafficking only represented 27% of the sample, that's the purple, compared to 42% of men and 40% of the entire sample. Women are more often victims of sexual exploitation, kidnapping, extortion, organ trafficking, and unlawful detention. We also found that women are categorically vulnerable to trafficking as a result of their gender, because only 50 women in our sample said that they had not experienced any form of trafficking. So the vast majority of women in our sample had experienced trafficking. Other socioeconomic markers had little bearing on the experience of trafficking. Gender was the only marker that made a difference. So level of education, family status, occupation, things like this did not show any difference amongst trafficking scores the way gender did. The next one that we look at is destination. So how does your destination affect your vulnerability to trafficking along these routes? The first thing that we found is that respondents targeting Europe are more trafficked than respondents who are targeting Africa. And this is mainly because there is a perception that migrants moving towards Europe must have greater economic means, and therefore they become more vulnerable to traffickers. They are also more badly trafficked or more severely trafficked. So 21% were victim of at least 3 forms of trafficking. About half were kidnapped and 2/3 were detained. This is further corroborated by the choice of route. So as I mentioned before, 59% of migrants in Mali said that they were targeting Europe, and only 10% of migrants in Niger said that they were targeting Europe. And then 70% of respondents in Mali reported being victims of trafficking, compared to only 49% in Niger and 60% across the entire sample, as shown in the graph below. Sorry, the graph below is showing the severity of trafficking. So we find that migrants in Mali are also more severely trafficked, with 18% being victim of at least 3 forms of trafficking, compared to only 6% in Niger and 12% across the entire sample. The longer you are on the road, the more likely you are to be trafficked, and the more severely so, as shown in the graph there. We looked at the trafficking score according to time on the road. Now, obviously, it makes sense to think the more you are on the road, the more likely you are to be trafficked, because there's more, let's say, time or more opportunities for you to be trafficked. But some of the other reasons that help explain why your duration affects your vulnerability to trafficking are that migrants often deplete their financial resources in northern Niger. So since the passing of the anti-smuggling law, the prices for smuggled journeys have increased, because it's become more difficult for smugglers to get migrants to Libya. And there's also been an increase in failed attempts. So your smuggler sometimes doesn't manage to get you across the border, and so you have to try again and again. And this means that often migrants will run out of money in northern Niger, and there are few avenues for income generation in the area other than working for the smuggler, which can increase their vulnerability to trafficking. Also, there has been an increase in raids and deportations in Algeria back to Mali and Niger, and this causes migrants to have to keep redoing segments of the route, which can cause them to run out of money and create vulnerability for them. Then we looked at finances. When we look at the budget on departure, the victims had more money with them when they left home. So 31% of victims had more than €500 with them when they left home, compared to 16% of non-trafficked respondents. The average budget of VOTs on departure was €571, compared to €359 for those who were not trafficked, and €484 for the overall sample. VOTs with greater financial means were more likely to be victims of detention and kidnapping, and those with less financial means were more likely to be victims of forced labor. Victims of sexual exploitation do not show much variation across the budget levels, as shown in the diagram here. Budget on departure, so looking at the amount of money migrants had when they left home against migrant type. The most important factor here, as shown in the diagram or the graph, is that the migrating respondents, so the respondents who were migrating, had more money on departure when compared to returned respondents or recently settled respondents. This suggests that migrants might have become aware of the increase in prices on the routes towards North Africa and Europe, and are preparing accordingly. We also found that 6% of migrating respondents refused to answer the question of how much money did you have with you when you left home, which also shows how sensitive this question is and how it can affect their vulnerability along the routes. And women also had a higher budget on departure, as did Christians when compared to Muslims. That's most likely because they're trying to address their vulnerability by taking more money with them. Now, when we look at budget on departure according to destination, we find that those who were targeting Europe as a destination had a budget of €821 on departure on average, and those that were targeting Africa had a budget of €277 on average on departure. So clearly those that are moving towards Europe do take a higher budget with them, and so this perception that traffickers have of migrants moving towards Europe having greater financial means is not unfounded, actually. Budgets are also higher for North African destinations when compared to sub-Saharan African destinations, and respondents targeting European countries also possess the highest budgets on departure. Respondents targeting France had the highest budgets of all European destinations, and respondents targeting Spain had the lowest budget of all European destinations, as shown in the graphs here. Some migrants also left some of their money at home. That is, they do not take all of their money with them. They take a little bit with them. They leave the rest at home and they ask someone to send money to them when they need it along the way. This is one way in which migrants have now learned to address their vulnerability to trafficking or abuse in the last few years. As you can see on the graph on the left-hand side, we had 32% of, or let's say 35% of migrants had left at least some of their money at home or with someone, and 63% are still continuing to take all of their money with them, which can render them vulnerable to trafficking. When we asked them who they left their money with, a whopping 29% said they left it with a smuggler, and 51% said they left it with friends or family at home, and 14% with friends or family abroad, 3% with an employer, and 3% with a bank. 70% of respondents who left their money with a smuggler reported being a victim of trafficking, compared to 60% of the overall sample. So that increases their vulnerability to trafficking. The highest incidence of trafficking is reported by those who left their money with an employer, with a reported trafficking rate of 95%. And those who left their money with friends or family or with a bank reported trafficking rates below the overall sample. In terms of sourcing money along the way, 39% borrowed money along the way, 64% from friends and family at home, and 50% from friends and family abroad. This question was a multiple response question, and respondents gave 1.28 responses on average, showing that migrants typically seek more than one source of money along the way. Only 3% reported borrowing money from a smuggler. In terms of working along the way, respondents that are targeting Europe are more likely to do that. And those that work along the way are more likely to be trafficked and also more severely trafficked. 61% of smugglers reported using a smuggler on the journey. And of that 61%, 63% of them were trafficked. So working with a smuggler has increased the vulnerability to trafficking. Migrants who moved with several different smugglers reported a higher incidence of trafficking and were more severely trafficked when compared to those who moved with one smuggler and the overall sample. All profiles of migrants reported using smugglers. Even 59% of the migrating respondents had used a smuggler to reach the Sahel, even though they were moving within ECOWAS and could have moved freely without the need for a smuggler. And most of the migrants interviewed in Niger said they had been taken to the trafficker by their smuggler, indicating greater cooperation between traffickers and smugglers in light of the anti-smuggling law that has most likely pushed smugglers deeper into illegality because of their loss of income-generating activity. We also found that the more services that were provided by the smuggler, the more positive the perception of the smuggler, because we had a series of questions where we looked at how migrants perceived their smuggler. I won't go into this in great detail right now because of time, but this is explained in great detail in the report. Then we looked at the level of information. 89% of the sample, so an overwhelming majority, felt that they were sufficiently informed about the journey on departure. And 90% of those who were trafficked in our sample felt that they had enough information about the journey, as did 90% of those who were trafficked 3 or more times. So everybody felt sufficiently informed. We asked migrants before leaving home, did you talk with other migrants or former migrants about the journey? I'm referring to the graph here, and 86% said yes. When we asked them before leaving home, did you get information from a smuggler? Only 28% said no. And when you left home, did you feel like you had all the information you needed about the journey? 89% said yes. When it comes to the difficulty and cost of going to Europe and the dangers of going to Libya, there is very little variation amongst the sample. Everybody believes that it's become dangerous and more difficult than before, as shown in the diagrams here. So those were the main findings of the study. I'm just going to go quickly through some of the recommendations of the report before I will hand it over to Q&A. In light of the information that the report gathered, we felt that the first recommendation was to use information as a protection tool rather than as a form of deterrence. I think that we have seen, former research has shown that migrants are very well informed about the risks of the journey, as this research has also again proven, and that knowing about the risks of the journey does not deter migrants. So using information as a deterrence mechanism is largely ineffective. But information can be used as a protection tool where migrants can be informed about the risks that await them so that they can prepare for those risks more appropriately. The second recommendation was to create community-led victim identification and reintegration programs, as victims and perpetrators of trafficking often live in the same communities and come from the same communities. So community-led initiatives are really necessary in this space. Also we recommended that we provide psychosocial support along the routes and in transit countries for migrants who are still moving, who have not returned home, but are in great need of psychosocial support. The fourth recommendation was to help national governments take the lead in counter trafficking through commissions based on the Nigerian model. Number 5 was to combat corruption along the route through greater migrant-led initiatives and accountability measures. Accountability measures can be things like rotating staff at borders more regularly, having to account for changes in staffing, basically because the research has shown that it is collusion between state officials and traffickers and smugglers in some geographies that is actually facilitating a lot of abuse. And finally, the last recommendation was to carry out ongoing research to track the changing patterns of vulnerability so that we can address these protection risks more adequately. So I'm going to leave it there so that we can have some time for questions and answers. It is quite dense, the study. I hope that I didn't move too quickly through the statistics, but I'm happy to answer any questions now that may have arisen in relation to the information that was just presented. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arezzo. Thank you for the very clear and always very engaging presentation. At least I found it fascinating, and I've read the report. So particularly pulling out, I think, some of the dynamics and the qualitative interpretations of your finding was very useful. We do already have questions flooding in, so I'm going to try and group them together for you. There are three looking at the question around definitions. So firstly, somebody asks, what is the definition of trafficking used in the report? Are respondents considered to have been victims of trafficking if they have been detained only? And to what extent do respondents perceive themselves to have been victims of trafficking? A second one similarly asked about our use of the word trafficking and victims of trafficking. The comment is that no doubts, people are highly mistreated and suffer all kinds of abuses. But the initial step to move and put themselves in the hands of traffickers comes from the people on the move themselves. And they suggest, should we be more attentive to the use of the word trafficking in this context? And then finally, one question asked why we included detention as a form of trafficking.
Thank you, Tuesday. So I will go through the questions one by one then. The first one was, what definition of trafficking did we use in the report? And to answer that question, we used the definition that comes from Article 3 of the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. So the definition was the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by means of threat or use of force or other forms of coercion, abduction, fraud, deception, abuse of power or of a position of vulnerability. Maybe I won't read the whole thing, but that's basically the definition that we did use. But of course, it's a valid question, the question about detention. and why we included detention and whether we included detention as part of the, those who had been detained as part of the victims of trafficking. So I'm grouping a few questions together there, but basically the idea was, we included detention because of the intimate link that exists today between detention and other forms of trafficking, particularly in the Libyan context. So in Libya, for example, we know that detention of migrants is a policy that has been increasing and is controversial because of militia groups also being involved, or armed groups being involved in the detention of migrants, not just the Libyan state. And in those detention centers, there are large, let's say, big dynamics of trafficking and various forms of trafficking occurring in those detention centers. So given that intimate link, we wanted to include detention as part of the 6 things we looked at. We acknowledge in the report that detention is not technically a form of trafficking, it's a form of abuse, but we do include it in the VOTs, as in those statistics include those that were detained. And the interesting finding that came out of the research is that actually there's a large, there are large rates of detention across the region, not just in Libya. And this is one of the interesting findings, I think, of the report. And then when it comes to the last question was about, I understood the question to be about kind of looking at this difference of victims that have been trafficked from their origin countries and victims that end up trafficked along the routes. And should we really be including the ones that are trafficked along the routes into this category, given that they put themselves in the hands of traffickers? It's a good question, and one that of course can generate a lot of debate and discussion. My personal opinion, that is based on the research and the results of the study, is that it's not necessarily that the migrants are putting themselves in the hands of traffickers, but they are putting themselves in the hands of smugglers. Because of the increased counter-smuggling work in the Sahel and North Africa over the last 5 years, we found that, for example, places like Agadez, for example, in northern Niger, that was one of the prime smuggling hubs for migrants trying to reach Libya, almost the entire local economy of that town was resting on smuggling. And so by doing counter-smuggling work in the region without promoting other forms of income generation to the same extent, meant that then the smugglers had to look for other forms of income and became vulnerable to other forms of illicit activity, and their cooperation with traffickers then increased. And so migrants that moved with smugglers then also became vulnerable to trafficking. So that's a little bit, I think, the nuance there. The third question, Tuesday, sorry, I didn't quite catch. Do you mind repeating that one? That's the last one that I haven't answered.
I think you got them.
Okay.
All right, so that's fine. So maybe we can move on to the next set. Sure. I have 2 questions around the insights you shared on the routes. So could you expand a bit on the reasons why migrants favor traveling through Mali rather than Niger? Given Mali's insecurity and Niger's established infrastructure for trafficking, well, smuggling, you could assume the opposite of what you uncovered through your research. And then a second question asked if you had any insights into why migrants are choosing to use smugglers in the Sahel despite the ECOWAS freedom of movement.
Thank you. Okay, so very good questions again, thank you. So yeah, this was an interesting finding, the one about, the prevalence of Mali as a route in comparison to Niger. Now, just to be clear, the data does not suggest that Mali is a more popular route in general, but that Mali is a more popular route for migrants who want to travel towards Europe. So if the intended destination is Europe, they are more likely to go through Mali as opposed to Niger. Part of the reasons, some of the reasons that came out to explain this from the data are the increased difficulty in now traveling from Niger into Libya. So a lot of migrants who do move into Niger today end up actually crossing the border into Algeria and then trying to enter Libya from the Algerian-Libyan border. So they cross in from the Nigerian border and they move a little bit north and then try and cross over again into Libya. And so because it's become so difficult to move from northern Niger into Libya. And so this is partly why migrants that want to go to Europe are now doing so through Mali instead of Niger. To answer the question as to why do we think migrants are using smugglers in the Sahel when there is free movement guaranteed by the ECOWAS protocols, it's a few reasons. There are a few reasons there. One of them is that, of course, it is a region of free movement, ECOWAS, but there are certain requirements that you have to fulfill in able to be able to take advantage of the free movement protocol. For example, you need to have a travel document, you need to have an international health card, and some migrants just don't have these documents. And so they have to cross those borders irregularly, even though technically they should have the right to travel regularly. The other reason, which I would argue is a more important reason or a bigger reason than the first one, is because of corruption at borders in the ECOWAS region. So a lot of migrants find that they are asked for bribes, even though they have the right to cross those borders regularly. They're often asked for bribes by border officials, and often by the time they get to Libya, they can be out of money because they've spent so much money on bribes. And so it becomes, in the end, somewhat cheaper and more efficient to travel with a smuggler who will move you over borders irregularly so that you can avoid the officials and not have to pay the bribes that they are asking.
Thanks, Arezzo. Couldn't have answered it better myself. Another set of two similar-ish questions around more specifically on types of trafficking. So one question asks, were the traffickers or smugglers attached to any labor contractors or job brokers? And then the second, of those who reported organ trafficking, what sorts of financial terms were being offered? Were any of these people physically coerced? Do you know which organs they were targeting for organ trafficking? And can you give any more detail about the Libyan venues where these operations were carried out?
Okay. Okay, I will start with the organ trafficking question. So the first thing I have to really point out here is that only 3% of our sample reported being victims of organ trafficking. So it's a very small number of respondents, and that makes it very hard for us to draw any big conclusions when it comes to organ trafficking. We just don't have enough, we didn't have enough data, enough respondents that are experienced it, basically. And to, a note on the methodology, we of course structured the sample in a way so that we can have a relatively representative or that the statistics and data that comes out of the sample can be relatively representative. And so therefore, if only 3% of our sample reported being victims of organ trafficking, then I would argue that means that it's low on these routes, that it's not happening in great numbers at the moment, but I do think that it's an increasing phenomenon. And while I don't really have any details on the types of organs. What I do have details on that, or how it happens, like whether they're offered money or not. What I do know, what I can tell you, is that we have seen instances of women in Nigeria who were trafficked for sexual exploitation, were later then pushed into organ trafficking. So there is this kind of switching between types of trafficking. We also found that while Libya used to be a location for organ trafficking, it's not so much in the current context. And so what we found is that we have new destinations for those organs, like Malaysia and Singapore. So Southeast Asia is showing up, and that we had instances of migrants being taken to Libya. their organs being harvested in Libya and then their organs being taken to countries like Malaysia or Singapore. So it's an emerging form of trafficking. It's not, the numbers are not very huge at the moment, but it's something interesting to keep track of to see how it starts to evolve. And my impression is that this form of trafficking is starting to increase and change because of the search for new income generating streams for traffickers, basically. And then the other question, I believe, was if the traffickers or smugglers were linked to employers specifically. Is that right, Tuesday?
If I understood it correctly, it's more employment agencies or brokers. Okay,
thank you. So I'm going to try and interpret the question. Like, I hope I understand correctly your point. So my understanding would be that we're looking at employment brokers or agents in the destination countries, whether that be in North Africa or Europe. So I do think that when it comes to trafficking within the region, like within Africa, so let's say in Libya, in North Africa being the destination, we have seen over the last few years networks, like the trafficking networks, becoming more transnational and more organized across the continent. And so there is greater cooperation between those receiving the victims in North Africa and those, let's say, coercing them in the origin countries. So in that sense, they are linked. When it comes to Europe, depends on the form of trafficking, but for example, when it comes to the trafficking for the purposes of sexual exploitation amongst women, we also see, you know, definitely connections between destination and source, because of course trafficking in general is also based on concepts of supply and demand. So if there is no demand for, you know, the female victims, then the supply is also going to diminish. And so that's why that connection exists. We also did find that in one of the other studies we completed around the same time, we did find that migrants who are being smuggled through Morocco to Europe today, many of them are being smuggled for employers in Europe who require migrant labor and can't really bring them over through legal channels. And so it's not trafficking, but rather migrants being smuggled for prearranged jobs. And then when they arrive in Europe, they are regularized by their employer. That information comes out in another report we're launching next week, which looks at, updates the migration dynamics through the Mediterranean. So look out for that on GI's website and on our social media.
Yep, good tease, thank you. Excellent. Maybe quite quick answers to these two because we still have a couple. So I've grouped the remaining questions. There's 2 on methodology, which I think you should be able to dispatch relatively quickly, and then quite a few on implications and responses. So okay. I'll give you these 2 on methodology, and then we can use the last 5 minutes of the conversation on the responses and implications. Sure. So one question, I'm interested on how respondents were tracked. Was this in person or using tech? And then a second, asking what baseline was used to qualify the increase in vulnerability to trafficking.
Okay. What baseline? Okay, so basically, when the question of how were respondents tracked in person or through tech, I guess that means how were the interviews carried out? How did we actually identify the respondents? And that was in person, yes. So our teams were on the ground in Niger and Mali, and they did face-to-face interviews with all 1,689 migrants that formed the sample. We did use tech in the sense that the enumerators were entering or completing the survey on tablets, and then the information was automatically uploaded into a database so that we could in real time track the work of the enumerators and keep an eye on quality assurance. But all 1,689 interviews were done face-to-face in person, and the qualitative interviews with migrants and key informants were also done face-to-face in person. And the second question was, what baseline did we use to track the increase in vulnerability? So we weren't actually tracking whether vulnerability had increased because we don't have a baseline to be able to do that. So it's a very good question. But what we were doing instead was trying to track how the pattern of vulnerability had shifted. So who today, the real question we were looking at is, who today is vulnerable to trafficking along these routes, or what characteristics can make you vulnerable to trafficking along these routes, or what circumstances can make you vulnerable to trafficking along the routes. Now, of course, we did also ask the respondents to tell us if they had been trafficked and how severely they had been trafficked, so that we could create a data set that looked at, you know, the prevalence of trafficking along the routes. And we also asked the migrants to report, like we asked migrants, what percentage of people on the routes do you think are being detained? Or what percentage of people do you think are being taken into forced labor? It was another way to try and track the prevalence of trafficking. But these two data sets, we understand, we use with caution, because we understand that, you know, we don't know. We're expecting the migrants to tell the truth, and some might not want to talk about their experience of trafficking. The real crux of the survey was to gauge how has the pattern of vulnerability shifted in relation to trafficking. And that, of course, can help us with our responses in terms of protection and risk management.
Thanks, Areto. So finally, a little cluster of questions around implications, donor responses. So I'll give them to you all four, and then we can decide how we cut them up.
Sure.
Firstly, open question: what are the implications of your findings for policy and programming from donor countries, especially considering that most tend to separate counter-smuggling and counter-trafficking responses? A second one, asking, could you kindly elaborate more on the needs of community-led victim identification and reintegration programs? With a chaser question from somebody else that asked, were you able to identify what percentage of the victims of trafficking are in need of international protection and thus cannot be returned? Third, more of a comment, but saying that without a wider or larger regional cooperation in trafficking, it appears that you'll end up in a whack-a-mole situation in which routes just change as traffickers find the least risky routes. And so how would you respond to that? And then finally, given that you've clearly shown in the research that women are more likely to be victims of trafficking and sexual abuse, did you have any findings on women that fell pregnant along the route? And what kind of protection implications are there for pregnant mothers and the protection of children?
Thank you, Tuesday. Okay, so very good questions. I guess I'll try and go through them one by one and quite quickly. What are the implications for policy and programming for donor countries was the first question, especially because they tend to separate counter-smuggling and counter-trafficking responses. So by donor countries, I guess we mean countries that are providing funding for organizations to address these issues along the way. Is that how you would understand that too, Tuesday? Yeah. So I think that it's a good question. And I think maybe one of the things that we need to start doing is looking more, and research and analysis can definitely help us with this, is to look more at this changing relationship between smuggling and trafficking, or let's say the greater overlapping between smuggling and trafficking along the routes to Europe, because I think the report very clearly shows that increased counter-smuggling work in the region is pushing smugglers into a position where they need to find other sources of income, and this is leading to greater cooperation with traffickers. So I think we need to, it would be helpful to understand these dynamics better. And maybe we need to relook at our programming responses in light of these changing dynamics in terms of increased cooperation between traffickers and smugglers. When we looked at Niger, for example, the vast majority of respondents who had experienced trafficking in Niger told us that their smuggler had taken them to their trafficker. When it comes to, I might then go to this question about wider regional cooperation, I think because it's a little bit linked. How is it going to work when traffickers and smugglers are finding dynamic and finding different routes? Exactly. I think this is the point. But I also think it's a little bit what the research keeps showing us. I mean, it's not the first time we've seen this. I think a lot of research over the last 5 years has come to the same conclusion, and that is that we can't stop the movements, that the routes, the smugglers, they are very dynamic, and that when we try and stop the movement of migrants towards Europe, they just find different routes and try and move in different directions. And the smugglers are there to meet the demand of the migrants in terms of also being dynamic and finding different routes. So I think that's, for me, the bigger point that comes out of this. But of course, this is not a new finding. This is something that this research has only corroborated, that has been already proven. There was another question of what percentage of the sample were in need of international protection and could not be returned home. It's a very good question. I must admit, we didn't look at that question in the study. We focused more on irregular migration and trafficking, especially, I think, given the region, because we were looking at West Africa and the Sahel, it's also not a region where we have a lot of refugee producing countries or people in need of asylum on those routes. So it's not something that we've really looked at. Now, of course, in the context of Libya, there is that debate where we can say migrants who depart Libya and are intercepted at sea and then returned to Libya, we can argue that it's in breach of their human rights because we know that they will be abused and tortured in Libya and returned to detention centers. And I think there was another question about women and about women who fall pregnant along the route. So yeah, it's definitely the study, in my opinion, the data has proven that women are categorically vulnerable to trafficking because of their gender. That being a woman alone makes you vulnerable to trafficking along these routes. And the very vast majority of women, like a very, very, very small percentage of women on these routes, are not trafficked. But when it comes to pregnancy, it's not something we looked at in the study, I must say. So I can't say for certain what percentage of women are falling pregnant along the route, but other research, I think, has shown that most women, even previous research of my own, has shown that most women on the route are, if not victims of sexual exploitation, are victim of some sort of sexual abuse along the way, and many do end up pregnant as a result. And the last question I want to address was a question about the community-led programs. And I think the point here was that the question was if I could elaborate on that. And the point here is that I think that the report has demonstrated that all of the victims, whether it's people that were recruited by traffickers in the source countries or along the way, they're affected by poverty and inequality. And this is what drives much of their decision making in terms of irregular migration and maybe even decisions that make them vulnerable to traffickers. And what's important, I think, also to remember as a group is that when these people go back to their country of origin, particularly if they've been forcibly returned, which is happening in increasing rates right now in Europe and in North Africa, they will have to contend again with the same conditions that rendered them vulnerable to traffickers to begin with. So if we want to address trafficking in a really meaningful way, of course, we want to protect those that are victims, but if we really want to try and prevent it, and look at how we can address these dynamics at their core, then I think we need the involvement of local communities, especially because many of the networks do operate through recruiters who are embedded in local communities in source countries. So, you know, this might mean engaging with traditional rulers or religious leaders or teachers or social workers or local civil society organizations to develop victim identification systems and victim reintegration systems that are grassroots and community-led. Because of course the flip side is also that many victims don't want to go back home because they're so ashamed of what they've experienced, particularly those that were forced into sexual exploitation. And so we need both victim identification systems and victim reintegration systems. And Nigeria has provided some really interesting examples of grassroots community-led initiatives in this regard, which I detail to some extent in the report, if you'd like to read more about that.
Arezzo, thank you so much for those answers. I don't think we have time for any more questions, and there are more. So I apologize to Sylvia, Camilla, and others who have pushed up questions in the last few minutes that we are not going to have a chance to answer them. We have put the GI email address into the chat. So if you want to email your questions, I'm sure Arezzo wouldn't mind responding to them afterwards. We do, of course, encourage you to read the report because some of the answers to those questions are actually in the report in full, and you'll find it on the same link that you'd found the invitation to this event. So a big thank you to everybody for participating. Arezzo did a mid-session plug of the fact that she does actually have another report coming out with us next week, which is on an update on the dynamics of different migration routes and the protection risk thereof along the Pan-Mediterranean basin. You will also have a chance to hear her on our next Africa and the Illicit Economy podcast, where she'll be talking about that report. So we encourage you to go in and hear more about her insights and look forward to the revelations that that piece of research will reveal. Arezzo, do you want to say anything last before we close off? And then we do actually have a little trailer for your podcast coming up.
Nice. No, I just wanted to thank everyone for attending and for all the really interesting questions. And I'm definitely available for further questions if anybody wants to reach out if they didn't get a chance to ask their question now. And thank you to you, Tuesday, also. Thank
you so much. We're going to roll our closeout little podcast trailer. So feel free to please stay. And you can also, if you want to listen to this presentation again, it will be up on our website along with a report. And we hope to see you at future events next time. Thank you very much and have a great day and a good weekend. Okay, thank you, everybody. Sorry about the technical problems with the video, but
Yeah.
next time. Have a great day, and we're signing off now. Thank you.